What is good, all you cool cats and kittens? This is your Commissioner Tim back at you 2 weeks straight with the Week 8 recap this time. Kicking off with the Week 8 matchups from last week, these were my chalk picks, selecting the sleeper favorites again this week. The matchup of the week, Full Jerry versus Huge Dicka, the phallic matchup. That went down to the wire. John pulls off an amazing win and gets his league high scoring for this week. This obviously came down to the wire on the conclusion of Monday Night Football game. It did wonders for Full Jerry's playoff chances, as well as potentially shakes up a few things regarding the final 3-2 playoff seeds as we head into the remaining 6 weeks of the regular season. Obviously, I can't talk about this week's matchups without highlighting this one. As we talked about in last week's video, I think really it's just going to come down to the highest pressure environment for the teams are obviously the ones who are trying to make the playoffs and fight for that fourth, fifth, sixth seed, however it ends up. But really, I think the highest pressure has to be on the three contenders who are going up trying to fight for the top two bye as they all sit even tied across the board at 6-1 heading into week 7. Obviously, they are into week 8. Obviously, they are 7-1 now. But like I said, for any of those three teams, anytime that they're going up against a non-contender, they have to win. It's a must win if they want to stay in this race. And this one between Moncton Meerkats and Wuxie Fingerhold really, really came down to the wire through Sunday night football games. And I think the Green Bay Packers and Aaron Rodgers rematch, the game against the Steelers, I think that was the one that decided it all. And Kyle dodges a bullet here. He moves up in his record and stays at 7-1 across three teams at large. And refreshing everyone, these were my picks, and I got 4 out of the 5 right in getting the Huge Dicka one incorrect. As with the rest of the league, all of us actually selected every single matchup except for Full Jerry and Huge Dicka's matchup, the phallic matchups. There are 3 teams, John, Brandon, and Brad, who selected the upset in Full Jerry to beat Huge Dicka, and they get the perfect 5 for 5 in this week. The only one who didn't participate this week was Sergey. So I will be sending out the week 9 fill outs for the pick'ems this week shortly after this video. So don't forget to do that. Maybe if I'm in a good mood again next week, I'll also allow for late entries as well. But I think after the Thursday night football games, there wasn't really anything conclusive per se, so it was okay for the late selections that were made. All right. So moving on into the week 9 power rankings, as you guys saw starting last week, we are past what I'll call the early part of the season. We're certainly in the mid-season window with 6 weeks left. This is all about ranking based on your playoff likelihood as well as the championship odds of the teams at large here. So this week, no movements in the bottom 2. We've got 2 shots, no cups still remaining as the only winless team in this league. And Kevin, who faces another loss, sitting at 2-6 now. They're going to be making up the 9-10. Kevin still has a very slight window to make the playoffs, and I'll talk about that later in this video. And then in this next group of teams, I think with the victory that I got to have against Huge Dicka this past week, moving up to 4-4 for the week. I'm talking about week 7 matchups. I think this really puts me safely into a tier that I will say still is a lock for the playoffs, sitting at 4-4 with what I believe to be the cutoff line for the playoff 6 seed that I'll talk about a little bit. But in this third tier, who are fighting for what I would think is a 5th and 6th seed, there was certainly a lot of movements. So Full Jerry picking up that victory over Huge Dicka. And by the way, these are not a fluke victory by any means. John was second in week 7, and he's league leading in week 8 in terms of points for. So you see a lot of boost towards the points for Full Jerry. And that's also to say, Huge Dick has also been having great last couple of weeks as well. So he's really moved up closer to that tier. I'm talking about Huge Dick in terms of the tier that gets close to the points for of the top 4 teams, and certainly the 3 teams who are in the race for the top 2 seed bye. But we got Full Jerry moving up 2 spots. And as a result, we got Wuxi Fingerhold and Bills Mafia, both who faced losses this past week, all respectively moving down a spot. In terms of the playoffs positions, obviously, Fantasy Pros has not had a chance to update. I want to get this video out when I had the time. So, really, I think these are sort of off the cuff for me. And I think Huge Deca certainly has the highest probability to get into the playoffs of the remaining teams and the remaining seeds. Still, there's a lot of things because he is sitting at 3 and 5. So he's at an 85% probability. And I think really is a toss up between Full Jerry and Wuxi Fingerhold. The only reason I still have Bills Mafia, obviously with a decent chance, a puncher's chance at making the playoffs, is because he does have a game ahead in terms of sitting 4 and 4 with a really good start to the first half of the season and getting the huge upset victory over me. I believe it was in week 6. But as you can see in the points for differences, there certainly is a tier. But respectively, I think the because it's only just a game apart, I think these 3-5 teams, all ranked ahead of Bills Mafia, is a fair assessment of how I see the probability of these teams making the playoffs. All right, so moving into the 3 teams who are in the race for the top 2 buys, we got Brazer Dynasty moving up 2 spots. These all 3 teams obviously won here, but Moncton Meerkats really dodged a bullet there, sneaking out a victory, barely scoring over 100 points against Wuxi Fingerhold on what was also a pretty down week for Wuxi Fingerhold. But it really bunched up the points for the 3 teams, certainly the top 4 as well. But yeah, this is how I have the week 9 power rankings. And I want to talk about now laser focus. We talked about last week in terms of these 2 races. Now with 6 games remaining, there's no changes to the teams or the projected cutoff that I think in terms of what's going to take to get to the top 2 buy seats. Storyline is still the same. Any of those top 3 teams who are contending for that top 2 is a must win if you're not going up against another top 4 team. So this is going to be a race that goes in through the remaining weeks of the season. Now, on the 5 and 6 seeds of changes from 4 to 6 to now 5 and 6, I think there's really 2 seeds on the line. Really, it's probably the 6th seed on the line if you think about Travis as the very, very likely one to make the 5th seed. Last we got the projected cutoff at 7 and 7, so that means for Huge Dicka, he would need to go 4 and 2 rest of the season. Full Jerry 4 and 2 rest of the season. Wuxi Fingerhold 4 and 2 rest of the season. Bills Mafia need to go 3 and 3. I want to zoom in onto this race in particular for this week's video. So there's 4 teams that I mentioned who are in the race for the 5th and 6th seeds. So I'll go one by one. The format that I'm going to follow is that for the 5th and 6th seed, in terms of team names, what their current record is, and what the rest of the season to make this commish gut win-loss for the 6th seed, which I think is actually going to be 6 and 8. And there's going to be a section on W's, and W's really is just the highly expected to win matchups. So teams that are certainly at least 2 rungs below the ladder in terms of power points for, or just the strength of the teams overall. Now, these are what I'll call must win because a loss here would only be made up with an upset win over a contender, which is going to be hard for a lot of the teams, minus maybe Huge Dicka and also Full Jerry in terms of how hot he's been on over the last couple of weeks. The second section here is sort of the highlight needle moving matchups or matchups for the teams that are highlighted. And this is the highlighting any competitive matchups, maybe teams in the same tier of power, strength. Not necessarily a must win, but a W here makes immense progress towards the playoff seeding and the likelihood of that team being highlighted making the playoffs. And then I also have a separate section against how many matchups in these remaining 6 weeks does that team have against one of the teams in the top 4. Obviously, the top 4 teams are in their own tier, so any of the teams that are being highlighted here, I think, are going to be big underdogs going into those weeks, just to show the strength of schedule for the rest of the season for each team. And then finally, a commish call, sort of what I dictate as notes or what I think, my gut tells me as the final record, as well as if they're going to make the playoffs or not. All right, so we'll start with the most likely to make the playoffs, which we got Huge Dicka currently sitting at 3-5, which means that to get to the commish gut for win loss for 6 seed is 6-8. But I've got Travis's rest of season outlook at 4-2, and that's because in week 10 he faces Bills Mafia, and week 11 he's got 2 shots, no cup. So call those 2 wins there. So you'd have to find 2 separate wins in the remaining weeks. And he's got a week 13 matchup against Wuxi Fingerhold. Now this one is going to be obviously a needle moving week for him. Because it is a team that he is theoretically fighting for one of the playoff seeds. But Travis has one of the hardest schedules for compared to other teams in this highlight, with all 3 remaining games, other than those 3 highlighted, they're going to be against the top 3, not even trust the process. The top 3 are what is going to be remaining 3 games. That said, he does have a very favorable bye schedule. So in the W's column is when he's facing a lot of the byes from his key players, including Jonathan Taylor, I believe in week 11 when he faces the bye week himself against 2 shots, no cup. I think my call is that Travis is going to finish out 7-7 after a disappointing start to the season, going 3-5. That's going to be good enough for a playoff seed at 5. And I also do think that Travis will steal a game against one of the 3 contenders that he's going to be facing as well. So that's how he gets to the 4-2, which gets him to the 7-7. But certainly a very likelihood that he finishes at 6-8 as well. Moving over to Full Jerry, 3-5 after a critical win this week against Huge Dicka. I've got John going 3-3 for the rest of the season, so he's got a decent week in a decent 2 matchups that are going to be probably easy wins, especially with the way that he's been playing. Week 9 this week against Bills Mafia, and week 13 against 2 shots no cup. So that's 2 wins that you can find there. I think the week 11 matchup is a needle mover that if he wins that matchup, and provided that week, unfortunately, is the week that he gets a bye for Indiana. So he's not going to have Indiana Jones, Danny Dimes playing that week. But if he's able to win that week, I think that's going to be good enough for him to go 6-8, and then for him to be likely not needing a tiebreaker or anything like that, good enough for the 6th seed as well. That said, he is same thing as Travis. He's got a tough slate of weeks where he's facing one of the top 4 teams in week 10, week 12, when he's got Herbert and Keenan out, as well as week 14 as well. So my call is week 8 win against Huge Dicka is absolutely huge. I think he's going to be finishing out 6-8. John is going to clinch a playoff berth, whether it's 5th or the 6th seed. And I could see John potentially stealing a game against a contender in one of those probably most likely week 10 or week 14, when he's at least got a full quarterback roster on the starting with Herbert as well as Jones. And if he steals a game, that's going to be 4-2 rest of the season, and that's going to get him good enough for 7-7, which again is not going to require any tiebreaker. At that point, it's just the consideration is going to be the 5th seed or the 6th seed. But I've got John making the playoffs, certainly. That said, my gut tells me that, but the numbers obviously are close enough where this team, Wuxi Fingerhold, who's also sitting at 3-5, has a chance to make the playoffs. In terms of odds, pretty similar to John at the moment. Rest of the season projection is at 2-4. Week 9, he's got Kevin Yip in week 9 this week. Week 14, he's up against Bills Mafia. There's 2 needle-moving weeks for Wuxi Fingerhold. Week 11, Full Jerry. Week 13, Huge Dicka. And Brad's also got his hands full, but this time he's got the lowest number of matchups against top 4 teams in week 10 and week 12. I think strength-wise, if Brad really, really wants to make the playoffs, even with no trades, as long as he's not engineering for potential losses for the remaining weeks before the lottery comes into the picture, I think he's going to be really, really pushing John for that 6th and final playoff race, 6th seed in the playoff race. But I think there's way too many incentives for Brad to barely sneak into playoffs. So I think the incentives for him, where he owns his own, as well as he owns Kevin's first for this upcoming year, I think Brad just wants to make the playoffs and make sure that at least the matchup against Kevin this week is that he takes the victory to shut the window down on Kevin playoff chances, as slim as is today. So Net net, I think Brad is going to finish out design 5-9. I don't think that's reflective of the actual strength of this team, but representing no playoffs. But again, next year rebuild two top four picks coming into 2027 season next year, 2026 season next season. So I've got Brad just on the outside looking in for the playoffs in terms of my gut feelings. All right, the other team, Bills Mafia, who is technically sitting sole fifth at a 4-4, or tied fourth with Trusted Process at 4-4. Might be a little harsh, but I do think Brandon's going to finish out winless for the remaining 6 games of the season. Again, that doesn't mean that I don't think he's going to be able to pick out a win here and there, but it's all incentives. I think here's what's going on. The Bills Mafia is the only team to face every single team on this highlight. So he faces these 4 teams, and there's a 5th bonus team in week 9, week 10, week 12, and week 14. So 4, not including himself. So every single team that's highlighted on this, he's the only team to be facing that many. And Brandon also has anti-incentive to make the playoffs. He's got his own first for this year. He's certainly rebuilding, and he's got all the incentive in the world to make sure he misses out on the playoffs. That said, the incentives that Brandon has is that he likely wants to see the weaker teams make the playoffs just for his own lottery odds come the toilet bowl. Would likely want Full Jerry, who he faces in week 9, and Kevin in week 12 instead of Huge Dicka, instead of Wooksy Fingerhold. So in week 10, it's interesting because he's facing Huge Dicka, who Huge Dicka at that point, likely because he faces Moncton Meerkats this week, Huge Dicka is likely going to be sitting at 3-6, and that starts to get into a little desperation territory. So it'd be really interesting whether that energy converts into a trade partner that makes sense, or whatever that might happen. But it could be really, really interesting. Again, I don't see Bills Mafia being able to beat Huge Dicka in week 10 by any means, but certainly I think there's going to be a lot of desperation energy in week 9, after Travis likely turns 3-6 facing Moncton Meerkats. Week 14 is really, really interesting because he faces Wooksy Fingerhold. And again, Brandon likely would rather see a team below Wooksy Fingerhold making the playoffs instead of Brad himself, because Brad's team is obviously stronger, and stronger teams in the toilet bowl, best ball, likely means that Brandon increases his lottery odds even more. So that week 14 potentially could be a clinching week for Wooksy Fingerhold, whether he makes the playoffs or not. So that'd be a really, really interesting matchup to look for there. All right, so I've got a 5th and a bonus team highlight because technically Kevin still has a chance to make the playoffs. He is sitting at 2-6. It's been a highly disappointing season for him. Again, like I said last week's video, man, if Kevin did not trade away Jonathan Taylor, this likely would be a very, very different standing for him. I've got Kevin going rest of the way at 2-4 on the most rational cases. Again, there's a lot of incentives on the line, so who knows what happens. But at the end of the day, even if you take the teams who are incentivized to not make the playoffs, let's say Brad and Brandon, so they take 2 of those teams out from this playoff race. If you've got me at one of the seeds and you've got, let's say, Travis, who's likely to make the playoffs, then there's only one more seed remaining, the 6th and final seed. That means that the race is going to be between Kevin versus Full Jerry. And now, because of John's upset over Huge Dicka this past week, there is a game difference between Kevin and Full Jerry. And Kevin is not going to win the points for tiebreaker that's going to be required if they end up with the same record, meaning Kevin needs to beat John by better than 2 games, better than a game. So 2 games at minimum difference for the remaining 6 games in the season. But if you just put it down, Kevin doesn't necessarily have an easy schedule. So he's got the week 14, so that's good enough for a win. And let's say that week 12, because Bill Mafia wants to lose, make sure that Kevin is able to get as many chances into the playoffs as possible. And for Bill's Mafia to also maintain their chances to not make the playoffs. Those are 2 wins. That's about the only wins that I see, because even with those lottery incentives of Bills Mafia and Wooksy Fingerholds, like I said, Wooksy Fingerhold himself is incentivized to beat Kevin this week. Even though Brad probably doesn't want to pick playoffs, he's probably okay to win at least one more, as Brad owns Kevin's own first. Now, the remaining games, three of the remaining games that are remaining I did not mention here, which is Bills Mafia and Wooksy Fingerhold, and Two Shots No Cup matchup in Week 14. All remaining three are against top four teams. And Kevin has not had a single week which will be good enough to beat any of those teams unless you really catch a really bad week from one of those teams and he goes on a season high that we haven't seen as a mark this week or this year. He would have to go 2-1 against those top four teams for the rest of the season, and that's going to be a very, very hard. It's going to be hard to catch a lightning once, and catching it twice is going to be a miracle. So I just don't currently see any path to the playoffs, even in the crazy incentivization period of both Brad and Bills Mafia wanting to pull themselves out of the race and try to push Kevin through the playoffs for their own incentives. I just don't necessarily see it happening, but I wanted to highlight the team here. So moving over to Week 9 matchups, we've got 5 matchups on the slate. Really all interesting games, but I am going to pick Trust the Process against Mr. Ambassador for this week as the matchup of the week, just because of the points for expectations for that matchup in particular. But there are 2 other matchups in this week that have implications for the races. So the matchup of the week, it's really just a top 2 race for Mr. Ambassador. Now, this week, because it is against a top 4 and not the bottom 6, this certainly doesn't move or make or break Mr. Ambassador's chances at making the top 2 seed. But certainly winning here really, really allows him to get a little bit margin of error for the remaining games in the season. The second matchup against Wooksy Fingerhold versus Kevin matchup. This was what I was talking about earlier in their team highlights. Wooksy Fingerhold owns Kevin's own first, and beating Kevin this week likely locks Kevin out of the playoffs, out of anything that could potentially happen. So that would be great for Brad to win this matchup. And for Kevin, he has to win to maintain the slimmest of the window chances at making the playoffs. Even in the crazy case of him getting pushed in, he would need to absolutely pick up a win here. And then the matchup where it's Moncton Meerkats versus Huge Dicka. This is a must win for Moncton Meerkats in terms of the top 2 race, because the cutoff line again is probably 12-2 for whoever gets the top 2 seed. And because I believe Kyle's facing 3 teams in the top 4 in the closing weeks of the season, this has to be a must win. For Huge Dicka, this is not necessarily a must win for him to make the playoffs, but winning here maintains sanity for him, where now he doesn't have to be part of any other storylines. He knows he's good for 4th, 5th, or 6th seed. He knows that he's good for the playoffs no matter where he ends up. And where you end up at 3 or you end up at 6 doesn't really do anything in terms of the matchups that you're going up against. So I think this is going to be a must win and certainly a matchup to watch this week. Now, for the commish picks, another week of chalk selections. I'm going with the sleeper favorites here. And for that's it for the Week 8 recaps. And hope you guys enjoy this week. Enjoy Thursday night football coming up, Sunday and Monday. Good luck, boys.